Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And not for the first time, we find ourselves contemplating behaviour on the other side of the Atlantic that I think it's fair to describe as pretty close to incomprehensible for an awful lot of us on this side of the pond. It's that famous Oscar Wilde line, isn't it, about two countries divided by a common language, but rarely does that divide feel deeper or wider than when it comes to gun control. A couple of things I mentioned to you a moment ago. The first was the recently installed British American editor of the Sun newspaper, has only been in the country for 2 years and has already witnessed 4 of the top 15 deadliest shootings that the country has ever seen. Donald Trump, of course, one of the first things he did after becoming president of the United States of America was to lift an Obama-era ban upon people with a history of mental health problems being able to buy guns. Obama couldn't do anything about gun control because he didn't control either house, and equally the appetite. There's a fascinating little article on the LBC website at the moment about all the American senators who have voted against gun control historically and who have received money from the National Rifle Association. I don't have a particularly sophisticated question for you this morning. I know that an awful lot of people who listen to this programme have roots in America. I know that increasingly we have a lot of listeners in America. They don't show up on the radio, sadly, but we know when we throw open the phone lines that people are listening over there. Is it helpful? Would it be helpful just to try to understand it? I mean, literally, to come at it from an angle where, to my British eyes, and I have a huge fondness for America, I still entertain hopes of living there one day, but to my British eyes, this suggests to me that a significant swathe of the American population cares more about the right to bear arms than they do about the life and the lives of young people. We know that the suspect, a 19-year-old who had been expelled from the school, was known to have a fetish, a fondness for guns. I don't know what word to use in this context. And we know that at least 17 people in Florida are now dead. He had posted disturbing material on social media and was, I quote, crazy about guns. So the question that you have as a Brit is, how can this happen? How can two cultures so closely entwined be so utterly at odds with each other when it comes to an issue such as firearms? I genuinely don't get it. You can hit the numbers now. You will get through it 6 minutes after 10. Coming up later in the programme, there is a story that I hesitate to say. I told you it was on the way. But you know that subject we discovered a few years ago together, whereby the further east you go on one of the London Underground lines, the shorter your life expectancy becomes. As you move into the poorer parts of town, your actual life expectancy gets shorter. The comparison between the country's wealthiest and the country's poorest since 2001 has actually got worse. So now 2 boys born in the same year, but in very different postcodes, will have a difference in their life expectancy of almost a decade. I'm interested in the big question of why, but I'm equally interested in why you think it has got worse while we've been spending time together on the radio, roughly the same sort of time scale. I'm not suggesting that we're responsible for it, but I'm intrigued to know what it is about life on the other side of the tracks that we find so difficult to understand. But we begin with life on the other side of the pond. How would you explain it to somebody sitting here now who said very, very simply, why don't you just ban guns? Or why don't you just make it much, much harder for Americans to own guns? Why don't you just create laws, change legislation that means to get a gun, while never impossible, just becomes considerably harder? That's all. You sit here and you don't know what gunshot sounds like, do you? Thankfully. You live in a country where a gunshot is exceptional. You'd automatically presume that it was a backfiring car, perhaps, or something other than firearms. You live in America, and you know when you turn on the news that there's a realistic chance of hearing about another shooting in another school. I can't even begin to wonder or work out why schools are such a target. I presume it's because young people alienated young people, unhappy young people, where once... I'm almost running out of words, and it's only 9 minutes after 10, but what would the British equivalent do? There's so many of them now, 18 this year alone. Is it just where a dispossessed or an alienated British youth would pick up a spray can and go and do some graffiti or some vandalism to try and just articulate their sense of loss and despair within them, an American, because guns are so endemic to their culture, so second nature to their lifestyle, that they don't have that sense of, what's the word? That sense of extraordinariness that we have. You see a gun as a British person, you're going to be freaked out. Am I right? You see a gun, you pick up a gun, you might understand its heft, you might even perhaps admire its engineering. I've been on territorial army shooting ranges. I understand the appeal of shooting. I understand the attraction of target shooting. But I can't, at the age of 46, even begin to imagine what it would be like as a teenager to see a gun as an integral part of my life. Piers Morgan, the British broadcaster, made very few friends in America when he campaigned vociferously against this. And like him, I just look at it and I think we have so much in common. These two countries, these two cultures, the same languages, the same cultural values in many ways, the same popular culture icons. We watch the same films, we listen to the same music, we eat largely the same food, for good or for ill. We seem ever closer to America, and Brexit will probably see those links grow further. But guns are so utterly at odds with our personal experience that I don't know, really, what question to ask you today, except the most simple one of all is why? What is the fundamental difference in our shared cultures? I know the history, I know the Constitution, I know the, a well-regulated militia, and the idea that the government might be coming at any point to steal your ranch or whatever it may be. But that can't be true of urban schoolboys. They're not sort of latter-day Wyatt Earps dreaming of the wild frontier. These are kids who are turned on by guns and whose fetishes and freakish enthusiasms are indulged by a society that seems to be utterly enthralled to the gun lobby. Is it just about money? Is it just that the National Rifle Association is so wealthy that it can bankroll so many politicians and secure so many concessions that there'll never be any meaningful progress made in this field? But even then, you sort of wonder why. Is it just that the markup on a gun is so huge that commercial interests protect the market so passionately? Because that, I guess, is as old as humanity itself, the idea that money is worth more than lives. And there will be parents at this school in Florida who probably historically saw themselves on the side of the gun lobby. Do you remember Charlton Heston? I thought Charlton Heston, I still do think he's one of the finest actors ever, and Ben-Hur, one of the best films ever. But when he gave that speech to the National Rifle Association, I don't think I've ever felt more at odds with America. When he said someone utterly iconic, utterly recognisable, utterly brilliant, stood up in front of the NRA and said, you'll have to, what was it? You'd have to claw my gun out of my cold, dead hand or something like that. And you sort of thought, whoa, hang on a minute. Didn't we sort of, weren't we raised in similar societies? Don't we subscribe to similar values? We call ourselves Christians, don't we, on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean? Thou shalt not kill. Fairly high up on most people's understanding of the Ten Commandments. And yet, in America today, when people suggest that it's too easy for somebody like Nicholas Cruz, a 19-year-old who'd been expelled from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, when somebody suggests today that it should be rendered harder for him to get hold of these lethal weapons, there will be an argument. And I don't honestly understand why. Why is there an argument? It's not about the right to bear arms. You can have bigger obstacles to overcome, bigger hoops to jump through, bigger problems to address. You can not render it impossible to get hold of a gun, but so easy. So easy. Why? Just tell me why. And I'll start at 30 minutes after 10 with a slightly optimistic or ambitious idea that we will confine our conversation, at least to start with, to people who have either American heritage or American experience, because I just don't know. I've got nothing on this one. come to the table with very, very little personal perspective. You have, and I've spent a lot of time in America, but I was interviewing David Schwimmer in Los Angeles. I wasn't hanging out with the gun lobby. I was knocking around with lobbyists in Washington, actually. I did meet a bloke in a Washington steakhouse who was carrying a concealed firearm, had a license to do so. And one of the people I was with thought it was really cool. I thought it was absolutely terrifying. Then you hear the arguments, as you will genuinely hear in America today, the argument that if there'd been more guns in that school, then the gunman could have been stopped sooner. It's like the Dylan Roof, the cinema shooting, when they said, well, if everyone in the cinema had had a gun, they could have shot the shooter. I mean, it's almost as if we're speaking a foreign language today, isn't it? American and guns versus English and no guns. Can we build a bridge? Can we come to any understanding whatsoever? And can we look at the politics? Why would it be? Is it just money? Because if it is, that's gross, isn't it? It's just money. Why? Well, the gun manufacturers make such enormous profits that they will protect their income streams regardless of how many young people have to die. Because I have to tell you, I've been doing this job for over a decade now. I can't remember how many times we've addressed this issue, but I don't see any prospect of anything changing anytime soon. If Barack Obama couldn't get movement on this, there's absolutely no prospect whatsoever of Donald Trump even trying. And it just seems so ingrained into the American culture that I just presume we're going to sit here for the rest of our lives. And every now and then, 18 times in 2018 alone, but every now and then we're going to glance across to our oldest friends internationally, our closest allies, arguably, and we're just going to shed a silent tear at their because I'm going to call it idiocy. It's a national idiocy. And where are the British, I beg your pardon, where are the American opponents? Why don't we ever hear from them? Is there a big lobby there calling for more sensible regulation, or is it a bit, I hesitate to draw a Brexit parallel, but of course you know the idea that the will of the people means that dissent or argument or debate or questions just aren't allowed. What's it like to be an American anti-gun campaigner? I couldn't name one. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. You can email me, you can tweet me, but I'd rather you called me for a whole heap of reasons, not least the fact that I came around. Thank you for your kind words. I had my first ever general anaesthetic on Tuesday. I came round after a little operation on my eye to find that somehow during the 2 hours I was under, I managed to contract the most vile dose of cold. So you may be called upon to keep talking while I indulge in a ludicrous coughing fit at some point during the next 3 hours. Mystery Hour coming up at 12. We'll have a look at social mobility and life expectancy at 11. But we begin very, very, very sadly with yet another question about yet another massacre in a country that feels so much closer than any other country perhaps on the planet, and yet on days like today so very, very far away. To why massacres like the one that occurred in Florida yesterday will continue to occur for the rest of our lives. I can't see any prospect of change. I would have thought, flawed though his presidency was, that if anybody in living memory was likely to tackle gun control in America, it would have been Barack Obama. Donald Trump, according to his friend Piers Morgan, is in the pocket of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. The list of politicians on the LBC website in America who take money from that organisation and then vote against any increases in gun control is endless, and you and me don't get it. Some of our callers do, and they'll help the rest of us perhaps not ever sympathise or empathise with the American obsession, but perhaps understand it. And we'll start with Phil, who's in Gibraltar. Phil, what would you like to say?
James, nice to speak to you again.
Likewise.
So basically, I wanted to talk about the NRA's undue influence on American politics and the hypocrisy at the very top of American politics. I don't want to get into what people receive. Obviously, that's a new website. Probably not. So the NRA actually has about 5 million members. So out of
what's the population of America? Remind me what the population of America is.
Around about 245 million.
So it's a tiny proportion of the population, then?
It's not. It's not just a tiny proportion of the population. It's a tiny proportion of the population of gun owners. There's about 81 million gun owners.
Oh, okay.
On the 2016 census. So it's even smaller than that. Now that NRA organisation has $433.9 million US as per the 2016 release of their revenue figures. So in terms of their ability to lobby, the only people ahead of them are basically the pharmaceutical companies and the banks.
And I mean, their self-interest is purely financial, is it? I mean, it is literally just a way to keep making profits out of selling guns.
Absolutely. The NRA has big holdings in Smith & Wesson, other big gun companies like that. I don't really think I should be promoting gun designs on the radio, but yeah, they have a lot of investments within them. A lot of the lobbyists from the NRA who lobby in Washington are ex-employees and shareholders of these companies. You can check their public declarations and their version of the members' interest. You can see all this. But the main thing I really want to talk about is the hypocrisy at the top end of politics.
Go on.
Now, President Reagan was one of the most avid pro-gun NRA presidents we've had in our time. Now, when he was governor of California, he passed legislation to ban the open carry laws. Now, as you've seen in recent history, people have tried to ban open carry. It's been heavily criticised. It's always been defeated. Now, in California, the reason they managed to get open carry passed through was because the Black Panther movement was open carrying on the streets. Now, I genuinely believe the whole of the gun culture in America is fueled by fear. Americans are terrified of each other. White people are scared of black people. Black people are scared of the police. Hispanics are scared of the government. The people are scared of the government. The government is scared of the people. And this circle of fear pushes people around and buys guns. Now,
it's chicken and egg. Forgive me for being glib, but I mean, what you say makes sense. But I'd be a lot less frightened of you if you didn't have a gun. Do you see what I mean? So it's the fear plus the guns, isn't it? Because they feed off each other.
The idea that the government would be frightened of people with guns, that's a myth, because you can't buy a tank, you can't buy a black.
So it's 323 million, the population of America, just to clarify. So over 320 million. That's all right, mate. It's no, I don't.
Sorry, 245 million is the population over 18. So people who can legally buy a gun.
Oh, okay. Well done. God, he's good.
Okay, but sorry, as I say, if the government wanted to come and take your land, they would take it. They would come with a tank. They would come with a helicopter. You can't fight that back with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle.
No, but is that where the mindset comes from? Because you're obviously right. The Constitution was written when people were carrying, you know, six-shooters and revolvers, and you could perhaps have defended yourself against federal forces in a blockade kind of way, and that mindset has persisted into future generations. Whereas obviously now they're going to turn up with drones and laser-guided missiles, unless you've got your own drones and laser-guided missiles, and presumably they are a lot easier to buy in America than they would be anywhere else. That fear of the government, you're right, is just, it feels anachronistic, but it doesn't change the fact that is how people feel.
But that's the underlying narrative that's sold. That's the underlying narrative that's bought, and that's what finances guns. I mean, it's well known that under Obama's presidency, guns have never been more profitable. People have never bought as many guns because that perpetuated idea of President Obama's coming for your gun was pushed by the Republican Party.
Well, by Fox News as well. I mean, when Roger Ailes left Fox News, there were some awful stories. Go on.
Yeah, gun companies don't advertise on CNN and MSNBC and the Washington Post. They advertise on Fox. They advertise on that gentleman that thinks that Sandy Hook was all fake.
The InfoWars guy.
I'm sure Alex Jones will be out on the radio today telling us all that this was a false flag operation too. And people will believe it. And people will be frightened, and people will buy more guns. And all we've got, and you're a lot of love coming in for you, Phil. A great opening call to the programme today. But the bottom line is fear, right? Fear, absolutely fear. And I genuinely believe, and I know this might sound a bit glib as my closing point, and it's not my line, it's a well-troped line, and lately Trevor Noah has been trumping it, but if you want guns to be removed from America, someone needs to buy every black person in America a gun, and they'll be banned overnight.
That's pretty bleak. Some people also suggesting that you could tell by the tone of Donald Trump's tweets yesterday that the shooter in this case was white. Because he speaks immediately of prayers and feelings and what have you, whereas if he was of a different skin colour, then arguably it would be another excuse to start talking about building walls and what have you. 27 minutes after 10 is the time. Phil, great stuff, mate. Thank you. Adam's in Cheshire. Adam, what can you tell us?
Hi there. First of all, totally agree with what the last caller was saying.
Yes.
I think it does come down to fear, but my personal opinion on it is my dad's from America. I've lived in England my whole life, and he was shot a year before I was born, told he'd never walk. He was shot by his best friend when he was having an argument.
Oh, so not even by accident?
No, he was shot. Obviously, because of that, my dad is totally anti-gun.
But prior to that?
Prior to that, he wasn't, obviously, because he's, in some cases, from Tennessee, where guns are part of society, which is what I was saying to the lady on the line before.
That's no lady, that's my producer.
Oh, so yeah, basically what I think is it's so enshrined in American society that guns are totally normal, totally legal, that it can't be changed. It just can't be changed. You can't make...
What would happen if they did? I mean, if you had a Democrat president, it would probably have to be a Democrat, and they controlled both houses. They could do it on paper. I don't know.
Technically, yes, they could do it, but how are they going to take the guns off the criminals? This is the argument. I mean, you go on about anti-gun lobbyists and stuff like that. I can't recall the name of an anti-gun lobbyist.
Nor can I, but we don't live there. I know Piers spent a lot of time banging the drum for it, and it didn't work out very well for him. Nothing changed, and if anything, it's worse than it ever was. But what would happen? Exactly. That's the thing that's so fascinating, because people are sending me some fascinating articles, all of which suggest it's a relatively small but incredibly powerful lobby, and that's where I'm led towards the conclusion it must just be about money. It must just be a question of protecting income streams and dividends.
I think that's got a lot to do with it, the lobbyist sort of thing, but at the same time, I do think it is what the last caller said. I don't think it's anything to do with the government. The people are scared of the government in America because it's a totally different system to the one that we have.
That's what we don't quite get, isn't it? We think we're the same. We think because we watch the same TV, we eat the same food, we listen to the same music, but guns are, I mean, it's beyond our ken, completely beyond our ken.
Yeah. That's the thing. They've been illegal in England, to my recollection, since 1991. Or 97.
Oh, but even prior to Dunblane, it was considerably harder, harder to carry one around, or even to own one. Why would it take your dad? This is, and I know he's not here to answer it, and I'm not going to mock him, but did he not realise what they were for before someone actually shot him?
No, I mean totally. I mean, he had quite a rough life when he was in America.
Sure.
But, at the same time, it was his friend, so he wouldn't have expected that. Just a trivial argument to end up like that.
Except that, if we had a trivial argument now, worst case scenario is that we'd take a swing at each other, or you might smash a chair over my back. If you've got a gun in your bedside cabinet, I'm dead.
That's British society for you, isn't it?
Yes.
That's the difference between the societies, and that's what I'm trying to say. In America, it's totally normal. You can't take the guns off the law-abiding citizens that carry them. This is the thing. Everyone carries a gun. If you're a father in America and you're in a state where guns are totally legal, if you're not carrying a gun, how are you meant to protect your children? How are you meant to protect your children? What are you going to do? Ring the police?
But how often? I mean, and again, this might be a problem with our media here. How often are there examples of people who have guns legally solving crimes, as it were, or protecting themselves? Because
I would actually say, if anyone would like to find out how guns can help people, to go on YouTube and type in something called active self-protection lessons. There's a man called John Carrera, runs a YouTube channel, and basically highlights how weapons are used to benefit the lives of innocent bystanders.
Well, I'll take your word for it. I'll have a look. I'm always a little bit... No, well, I might, but just for the record, I'm a little bit wary when people spring YouTube references on me without clearing it in advance, because I've got no way of checking or validating prior to you apparently endorsing. But you clearly know what you're talking about, and I suppose having had your dad being shot by his mate before moving to England does put a slightly urgent perspective on things. What would happen then, Adam, thank you, what would happen if a politician did actually move this particular mountain? What would happen? How would America be in any way worse? Would it be that the illegally held gun owners would somehow be on the rampage, and legal gun owners would feel even more besieged and frightened? Because they seem, as our first caller suggested, they seem pretty besieged and frightened already. 10:32 is the time. It wasn't ever thus, I'm learning. I always learn when you start sending me stuff I didn't know before. Second Amendment, of course, I knew this, going back decades, was introduced because the public were outraged by the Boston massacre. 5 civilians killed by 9 US militiamen using 18th century muskets. My pocket encyclopedia, Incorrigible FCA, is tweeting a lot of information down that route. And it also has its roots in relatively modern American history, the weaponization, if you'd pardon the pun, of the NRA, the politicization of guns, and that makes it even harder to understand in a way, because the notion of it being a throwback to the days of the Wild West and the frontiers is poetic and romantic in a sense, but it's meaningless. 18th century muskets. You could realistically have a chance of you defending yourself against government soldiers with muskets. You've got no chance whatsoever of defending yourself as a civilian, even with a well-regulated militia, against the American federal government. And to be fair, why the hell would you want to? But odd times. 10:38. Brett is in Harlow. Brett, can you help us understand this?
Hopefully so. Hi, James.
Hey, Brett. How are you?
Hi. I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Don't ask, mate. Seriously, I know you're just being polite.
I am. Yeah. Well, I wanted to speak to you. I think I have a good grasp on what's going on. I'm American myself.
Yeah.
I've lived over here now for about 5 or 6 years. A bit removed from it, but I still have many friends and family. I still visit the country a few times a year, and I see it all the time. I think where it starts with there's a culture of this toxic masculinity where when you have a gun, they want everybody to be afraid of you because you have a gun, right? Everyone's afraid of criminals. They're afraid of, their other neighbors. They're afraid of the person down the road. And they want this gun so that when they can stand up and say, come and get me. I've got my gun. You come at me. You come at my family. I'll take you out. That makes them feel powerful. That makes them feel strong. And that's what they want. And it just keeps happening.
Does it, though? Because it just seems to be simultaneously empowering and fearful, doesn't it? It's because...
Yes, it's kind of like a dog chasing its own tail.
Exactly, yes.
You'll never get out of that cycle. And what ends up happening is, there's other, prongs to this as well. You have the American healthcare system that is shockingly and appallingly bad at treating mental health care, the mental health issues. So you have millions of Americans walking around with undiagnosed mental health issues that could range anywhere from schizophrenia to depression to anger management issues. And because they've, some of these people have never, ever in their life seen a mental health professional, these people don't understand that they have these conditions. And they do have background checks that will address mental health.
In some states, but not in others. And one of the first things that Trump did, and this I do find astonishing, to be honest with you, I'd forgotten that I said this back in October of last year, because I got to work this morning and I saw that the internet department had resurrected a little clip of me back in October saying, why is there not more concern about Donald Trump lifting restrictions on people with mental health issues from getting guns? And if you had to write down a legislative process for a politician to undertake, and you wrote down, let's make it easier for people who are mentally ill to buy guns. This is not a figure. I'm spluttering genuinely. It's not my cold. I'm genuinely spluttering now.
Yeah, the problem is that the gun owners see this as punishing innocent, law-abiding citizens who have never done anything wrong, punishing them for the crimes and the sins of these people who choose to break the law. They don't consider themselves to be potentially law-breaking people because, these big, the mass shootings in Vegas, for example,
yes.
That guy was a law-abiding citizen his whole life. He probably walked around, after all of these school shootings and mass shootings saying, I'm a law-abiding citizen, don't take my guns from me, until, a year later, because he has mental health issues again, he snaps and he probably, goes and shoots, 100 or 500 some odd people. And, and then you have that coupled with the legislative issue that you were speaking with the NRA, where they know that as soon as they bring in these mental health checks, that's going to cut their gun sales by, guessing 50%.
Is it that cynical? Is it because I've got nothing else? I've got no reason to doubt you, but it really is just looking at the profit margins and thinking, well, if we're not allowed to sell to people who, if you have to have a full-on psychiatric assessment before you're allowed a gun, that's half our market gone overnight.
Yeah, exactly, because they do have the background checks for mental health. However, the only check that it says, do you suffer from mental health issues?
No.
And of course, if you want a gun, you're just going to say no, and there's no check after that. It's a self-identification process. And end of story.
Who speaks for you, Brett? Because we only really, and I make no apology for this, it's the nature of both beasts, the American and the British, the media and the population, the wider population. We only talk about this when it's in the shadow of a tragedy, a massacre such as the one that unfolded yesterday. But perhaps we should do it on a day when we're not actually counting the corpses, and we could ask, who speaks for you? Is there... I mean, Trevor Noah, the late-night comedians, I'm familiar with them. The line from Trevor Noah about if you want gun control, give every black man in America a gun and they'll ban them by the end of the week. That's pretty powerful. But who speaks for Americans like you, and how many of you are there?
The Americans speak for themselves. If you look at the polls and the statistics, it's something like 80% of Americans want universal background checks that are strict, stringent, and weed out the people who are going to break the law and hurt.
Seriously? So it is just the politicians that are preventing the population from getting their changes?
Everybody wants the changes. However, the things that are preventing the changes are the NRA, who shell out millions and billions of dollars a year to these lawmakers because they need money to get reelected every year. So they fund these politicians, and the politicians know that if they go against the NRA, then that big fat chunk of money that's given to them to get reelected gets taken away immediately, and that their chances for reelection go down drastically.
Well, could you indulge my naivety then? Briefly, okay. Why don't they just start a massive fundraiser? If it's 80% of the population want it to stop, why don't they just match the donations from the NRA?
Well, they have that now. They have these what they call super PACs, where people can donate money, and that's the problem is that everybody can give unlimited amounts of money to any politician they want, including corporations, large, massive. And nobody
makes a profit out of opposing the sale of something. So the people, the people promoting the sale are always going to have deeper pockets than the people saying stop selling. It'd be like drugs, wouldn't it? If you had drug dealers, in fact, these opioid crises that are sweeping America fit into this model very nicely. People essentially making millions out of the misery of people who are addicted to a synthetic form of heroin. Who's going to fight that? Because no one's making a load of money out of saying, don't buy stuff.
Yeah, James, end all be all, follow the money.
Follow the money.
End all be all, follow the money. Who stands to lose the most if guns were restricted? Gun manufacturers.
And they will be funding the NRA, and the NRA will be funding the politicians. But I mean, again, I'm not suggesting that politicians are possessors of particularly functional moral compasses, but I do wonder how, I can't ask you this, Brett, because it's rhetorical, but how do they sleep at night? Is it by just conjuring up these ludicrous justifications that, well, someone's tweeted me saying they had an argument last time there was a massacre, they were arguing at work, an American colleague joined in and said, well, imagine if all the Germans had had guns in the run-up to the Second World War, they'd have been able to stop the Nazis. And you just think, even after 18 months of arguing with supporters of Brexit, I can't, I mean, that level of absurdity, just maybe you do have to engage with it more. Empowering inadequate people, and by inadequate, I just mean people who are pathetic. And if you have a gun, you cease to be pathetic, you become terrifying. So the more conscious you are of your own patheticness, your own inadequacies, your own failings, the more drawn you are perhaps to gun culture. I'm just learning a little more about the gentleman responsible for the latest massacre in America, the latest school massacre. 17 people dead so far, and his social media presence suggests a degree of craziness about guns, about firearms, and also that this should have been seen. But as I understand the culture, and as I've said a few times today, rarely does the Atlantic seem as wide as it does today. It would almost be controversial to suggest that somebody boasting on social media about how much they like guns should have his collar felt, should be locked up. It's so almost intrinsic to the American identity for this curious and much smaller than perhaps we realise rump of the population. And I would like to know what would happen if they did take serious steps to address this. What would people lose if they spend their lives feeling terrorised and frightened? And speaking of terrorised, of course, the NRA campaigned against the ban on gun sales to anyone on a terror watch list. I'll say that again because it's like Donald Trump rescinding Obama-era restrictions on people with a history of mental health being able to access guns, the National Rifle Association campaigned against a ban on gun sales to people on a terror watch list. Okay? This is madness. And yet it just continues, and like most of my callers so far today, I see no prospect of it ever ending. 10:52 is the time. Nabil is in Boston, in America. Nabil, what can you tell us?
Hi, James. It's a pleasure to be on with you. Well, I do disagree with your last caller that this is purely financial, having to do with the NRA. It's certainly a part of it. But unfortunately, when Obama was president and you had these sorts of massacres, the next days, gun sales actually spiked. They went through the roof.
Yeah.
So people really were afraid that somebody would take their guns away. So
that's because Fox News was telling them. Fox News was telling them that Obama was going to take their guns away. So they were trying to stock up before it happened. I do understand that, but I mean, there could have been a way of doing it. Couldn't you just spring it on them without telling them in advance?
Well, I mean, I don't think. Listen, the government obviously has a monopoly on violence, so they're not going to start a revolution. But it wouldn't be pretty. Who knows what it would look like?
Yeah.
But I would not.
What do you think then? I mean, Boston is a very civilized part of America. I mean, if they did genuinely attempt, and you're right, goodness knows how it would be done. It would be logistically almost impossible. But if they genuinely attempted, first of all, to stop the sale of more, that would be quite easy. And then they addressed the idea of getting rid of the ones that are already there. Would you imagine people on the streets of Boston, tooled up to the eyeballs, trying to resist the federal authorities?
Certainly not. But like you say, I'm in Boston, so in both our countries, I'm what you would call, liberal metropolitan elite. So I'm not
not a racist, as we call it in Britain.
Fair enough. I mean, it's tough. I do think, we shouldn't kind of scoff at the frontier culture of it. I do think that is part of it. I think that it started with practical reasons. I mean, people on these frontiers, they had to worry about the Native Americans whose land we were stealing. Then obviously the Haitian Revolution happened, and all of a sudden everybody in the South was worried that their slaves would revolt, and we need protection from that. And then there's the whole element of, you're self-sufficient. It's really a tool to have a weapon when you're in the Wild West, 150 years ago. And then you have the Civil War happen, where you feel like the federal government was imposing on you. All these things fit together for, practical reasons where you felt like you needed a gun, and those practical reasons slowly faded away. There's not so much a reason for a gun anymore. However,
but the emotional hangover remains. There's an emotional connection that remains, and it defies, like an awful lot of the biggest political problems of our times, it defies logic and analysis. It's about putting feelings over facts.
Exactly. And you hear words like, you hear the kind of rhetoric like you want to protect your family. It reminds me a lot when people invoke sovereignty in the Brexit debate. All these kind of lofty words, and there's not actually any bedrock to what they're saying. Kind of makes them, it just kind of supports their intuitions that's been spoon-fed to them. There's nothing really behind it. But yeah, like you said, even though it seems like this surface level belief and there's not much to actually, they don't have anything to actually rationalize it, it still is unbelievably deep. But I think the one thing that both sides can agree on is that we need way tougher checks on mental health. And I think that's something to build upon. It's not nearly enough, but that is where we need to focus.
Now, this young man here seems to be poorly. And I just for the record, and I'm in no way are you guilty of this. I'm correcting myself, really. I'm uncomfortable with this kind of conflation of the two. Plenty of people with mental health problems are no more likely to pick up a gun and start shooting school children than you or I are. But it is obviously an exacerbating issue. Just a couple of tweets that have come in while you've been talking. Michael's out in the cab today. Says he's got an American couple in the back of the cab who can obviously hear your programme. And I just heard the lady say to her partner, that boy's name was Cruz. He's obviously Hispanic. When we sit on this side, we've got our own problems with the resurrection of racism in this country at the moment. But it does seem odd that Donald Trump could talk about banning Muslims from America and be utterly opposed to actually banning guns. It's almost beyond explanation.
Yeah, I mean, it's Donald Trump, as far as his position on guns, he has no ideology whatsoever as far as what can get him the most positive press, whatever. He has, it's like any issue you can pick. There's no, you want to talk about somebody who just says things without any sort of bedrock to what he's saying. So yeah, certainly. But let me just, if I can also just add one more thing.
Of course.
You're right. It's not just a mental health thing, but there's another element that I don't know if people talk about enough, and that's how the younger generations. I'm 26, so my generation also a little bit younger. How much people obsess over the idea of getting famous. It's so easy nowadays, and you see everybody around you just blowing up from, an Instagram post here or there. And if you're a person who has some sort of problems and, socially awkward or what have you, not even, you have a severe mental problem, but just crippling loneliness, a bad family life, and you see these images on social media, see all the attention this gets, and it's terrible. It's like Robin Williams when that man, when he committed suicide, the next year there was like a 10% spike in suicide. People just see things and the images get stuck in their head, and so that's why you definitely don't want to put this guy's image on a TV.
Well, no, but that's also true of terrorism, isn't it? I do increasingly wonder whether we almost lionize or provide infamy to these people who, as you suggest, probably do in part undertake these terrible crimes in pursuit of some form of infamy or some form of recognition. How does it reach your American ears when you hear somebody like me say, from a position of quite profound ignorance, I make no bones about that on days like today, that it seems to me that significant swathes of America hold Second Amendment rights in higher esteem than not just other people's children, but ultimately their own children's safety?
Well, I mean, because in their minds, the Second Amendment is what protects their children. Again, that's what's ingrained in them. They really do believe that having more guns keeps people safer, and I'm sure you can point to situations where that is the case. But that is, it's that belief. I think that is the core. I think that's what people from far away really have to understand, is that it's not like the people are just saying, well, listen, it's going to increase the chance that there's going to be a shooting at my child's school, but hey, it's a right, whatever. I mean, this is important. It's history, and it's my identity. It's not that facile. They really do believe that it's actually keeping their child safe.
Yeah, and that is important to understand, because you can't unpick that position if you're ignorant of it. Although a statistic that just stops me in my tracks: only 3% of Americans own over 50% of all the guns in circulation. That's because the collectors, the real enthusiasts, will have rooms full of the stuff, and quite often, as we saw in Vegas, they'll have mini armories, some of these people. But of course, it's a slightly misleading statistic, because there'll be a significant proportion of people who've just got one. The other 50% of guns will be spread out among a much broader section. Nabil, thank you. Always useful to hear. Well, I had quite a few American accents. Nabil, I think the only one actually ringing in from America. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. I may take a couple more calls on this. A very international flavour to the programme today. I notice that Leo, who's waiting to talk to us, is in Geneva. But I want to draw your attention after the news also to a very British story, a very domestic tale, and one that whatever phrases you use to deride people who insist upon trying to be good or to make the world a better place, whether you call it virtue signalling or snowflakery or the belief that people are fundamentally decent. If you are in that camp, this story will break your heart. The postcode where you're born impacts upon how long you live.
On FM, online, on your mobile, and on digital radio. Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
Where we draw a line, very sadly, under the latest story from America involving a high school massacre. It's estimated that about 7,000 American children every year are killed or injured by gun crime, and I'm no closer really to understanding why, except that old line of following the money. In fact, a couple of you have pointed out that the simple hardware involved, if you look, I mean, it's essentially metal tubes, isn't it? And the cost and the money, the markup, compared to other metal tubes or other pieces of precision engineering is huge. So it seems a little simplistic, but how many of the great mysteries of our species are solved by following the money? We'll return to that. I just said to Beth, the producer, we'll move on now because we want to talk about other things, and we will probably be discussing it again with another tragedy in the rearview mirror not too far from now. I don't know when it will ever change.